And it's time for Uncancelled, where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. But tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the world's top health professionals. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is a professor of medicine at Stanford University. He's also one of the world's leading infectious disease epidemiologists and the author of the Great Barrington Declaration. Now, that is a controversial open letter which urges governments to try to get life back to normal for all but those who need to be shielded, pointing to lost education, unemployment, eternal debt, a tsunami of emotional health issues, plus waves of deaths from other medical conditions. It speaks of grave concerns about governments' responses that have caused irreparable damage. Despite this, the declaration has faced criticism, with former Health Secretary Matt Hancock himself claiming it was a flawed virus strategy and others dubbing it far-fetched. But Dr. Bhattacharya stands by the declaration and even goes as far to say that lockdowns will one day be seen as the single biggest public health mistake in history. Tomorrow, we've just learned Boris Johnson will unveil plans for the final step of the roadmap in England, with restrictions set to end on the 19th of July, but only if the government's 4 tests have been met. So, Professor Bhattacharya, it is great to have you here. What's your summary, Professor, of how the UK government has handled lockdowns? Because we seem to have gone harder in the UK than most other countries around the world. Can you understand why?
I think the UK government should declare success, a great success. What you have done is you have vaccinated and protected the vulnerable population. There's a 1,000-fold difference between the risk of death from people who are older to people who are younger. And with the vaccine campaign, incredibly successful, near the best in the world probably, with maybe Israel as the exception, you've had an enormous success in that. And you can see what the success is in this wave of cases. You see cases rising now in the UK, but deaths and hospitalizations are flat. That is because you've finally worked on a strategy of focused protection, just as we argued for in October of last year in the Great Barrington Declaration. I think there have been mistakes, unfortunate ones, that have caused incredible harm to the population, not having to do with COVID. But let's put that in the past. What we should do now is declare the enormous success of the UK strategy in protecting the old, and essentially it's a victory of focused protection.
Yeah, indeed. And Dr. Bhattacharya, though, just to go back to last year, though, because it's going to be picked over in years to come, including a major public inquiry in the UK, is your contention that if the government hadn't of locked down so hard and had introduced a focused protection policy, the type that you advocate for in the Great Barrington Declaration, that we would have avoided such deaths in the second wave?
I mean, I think the key, it's really hard, right? Because I don't think perfect focused protection is possible anywhere when the disease is widespread. But you can do better than in places like the UK. And actually, I shouldn't just blame the UK. Where I live, California did. And the key is that you have to think to yourself that it is possible, and then start designing policies, for instance, to protect nursing homes. A lot of the deaths in the UK have happened in care homes, and just as in California, where I live, many of the deaths have happened in nursing homes. You have to protect people live in the workforce, older people in the workforce, who, if exposed to the virus, would face dire risk. So for essential workers that are required to go out, maybe give them sick leave or give them lots and lots of strategies were possible, and not all of them adopted. Instead, the UK and many other places adopted lockdowns, which have caused incredible harm. Just as you said, Dan, at the beginning of the introduction, the harm includes damaged, delayed medical services. Like many women skipped mammograms. They're going to show up this year with stage 4 breast cancer that should have been picked up last year, and they will die from it, and they should not have died from it. Where there are untold damage to the mental health of the population, and we could go on and on. The harms of the lockdown are incredible. If you go to collateralglobal.org, where I'm working on trying to document these harms, which I hope the public inquiries look into when they're done, because it's not just a costless intervention; it's an enormously costly one. Internationally, it's thrown tens of millions of people into poverty worldwide, including starvation. Hundreds of thousands of children in South Asia, for instance, are killed, dead from starvation and malnutrition as a result of the lockdowns. So it was a very harmful, costly strategy. And I actually don't think it protected the old. Despite the lockdowns, you had terrible outcomes in the UK and elsewhere. I'll just give you an example of a success story. In Florida, which actually followed a focused protection strategy, it's had lower mortality once you adjust for the age, the older age distribution in Florida than California. Actually, even if you don't do the adjustment, it's had lower. And California is locked down. For a year and a half, my children have not had normal school, whereas in Florida, 100% of the schools have been in person. So to answer your question, yeah, it's a complete mistake to have relied on lockdowns as a strategy. It's not actually protected people against COVID and has had all these collateral harms. At the same time, I also celebrate what we've achieved. I don't think it's not just that we should look back and pick at what we did. I agree with you, Dan. It's worth doing that, but it's also worth celebrating. I mean, we are at the verge of VC Day, Victory Over Coronavirus Day, and we should celebrate that fact. And it's a major achievement, both for the UK and elsewhere, that have protected the old from this terrible disease.
Indeed, it's just so shocking to me that so many people don't want it to be over, don't seem to accept that the vaccine program, and especially the rollout in the UK and the US, has completely smashed the link between infections and hospitalizations. I don't get it. People seem to want to keep this thing going. I think you're right to point to real world examples, though, because it's not just Florida, is it? Texas is another US state that lifted all restrictions and actually saw the death rate plummet. And Sweden, we know, has always had a different policy. And while in the early days they failed in terms of the protection within care homes, they've actually kept much more of society going without draconian restrictions.
You're absolutely right. And Sweden is a great example where they learned during the course of the epidemic who was most vulnerable and worked to protect them. In the early days in Stockholm, unfortunately, they exposed the many older people living in care homes, and they had much death in that first wave as a consequence. During the second wave, and later though, they've worked on focused protection quite hard. And what they've done is they've kept a full year and some of schooling for their kids normal, unlike many places like in the United States that didn't. Our kids are going to be worse off than the Swedish kids as a consequence of that. They've had normal schooling without masks, without social distancing, and they've had better outcomes for their teachers than other occupations, and no deaths, I think, or very, very few deaths among children, fewer than they would expect from just the flu. So I think this is one of these things where you theoretically think to yourself, oh, we have to lock down or else we're hurting people. But it's not. That theory has not been proved. In fact, it's been disproved in real world applications worldwide. And we should heed that lesson.
I'm worried, though, Dr. Bhattacharya, that lockdowns might be used again for COVID, maybe for a particularly bad flu season, because it feels like they've been broadly accepted by the public. Do you share those same concerns?
I am concerned about that, Dan. But I think that much of that concern, much of the broad support for lockdowns in the public comes out of a place of fear. And that fear was unfortunately a explicit government policy. SAGE, for instance, I think had a subgroup that explicitly adopted a policy of inducing fear, working with media to induce fear.
We've spoken about that throughout the show tonight, actually.
It's shocking to me to hear that, actually. That's a violation of a basic principle of public health, that you tell the public the truth. You don't panic them. You do not use panic to control behavior. That is an ethical violation. And actually, it leads in the long run to undermining the trust that people have in public health. So I think that's where we're headed. I think that as the fear dissipates, people will start to say to themselves, was what we did right? And trust in public health may be undermined. But I think, I think we have to work very hard against that. We have to tell people, look, we did this wrong, straightforwardly say we did this wrong. And I think over time, public opinion will start to change, just as it did in other, it's the Iraq War. I remember how popular it was once, and yet now people mostly understand it was an error. I think that the same thing will happen with the lockdowns. That the lockdowns, while many people supported them reasonably because they were scared, will come to be seen as something something we should never have done and should never do again.